Many of you have been joining every day, so good to see some familiar faces here. I'm really excited for today's presentation. Jennifer Walling, our Executive Director, will be on in a little bit to help moderate some of this conversation, but as Legislative Director, I get the pleasure of working with Openlands on a lot of priorities, and so today we're going to talk about the Waters of the United States rule. This is a CLE presentation, so if you are an attorney and you'd like to get some CLE credit, I will submit into the chat some instructions as well as a link where you can click to fill out the CLE requirements and make sure you get that credit. So we've been doing these Lunch and Learn series every day since March 18th. I think they've been a really great way to keep our community connected during this difficult time. And they're all recorded and made publicly available on our YouTube channel. So you can check out a wide variety of issue topics if you've missed some of them over the last couple of weeks. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Illinois Environmental Council, since we were founded in 1975 by a group of dedicated grassroots environmentalists, IEC has really led advocacy campaigns by allowing environmental organizations, certainly our partners in Openlands and more than 90 other organizations throughout the state, to pool resources so that IEC can create a higher profile for environmental issues and really be the trusted voice of this community in Springfield and in other spaces. If you're not a member of IEC already and you are able to give, please consider joining today by using the link again in the chat box. We'll be putting, Jeff Sheldon, our development director, is helping with some technical assistance today too. So he'll be doing some of the housekeeping items. Everyone is muted, and if you joined by Zoom and you have questions throughout this presentation as things come up, again, feel free to use that chat function. We are going to do Q&A at the end, but as we see some, and maybe Molly and Laura can build that into their presentation, we'll address questions that way as well. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Molly Kordas and Laura Bargadzen to take us into today's presentation on the Waters of the United States rule. This is incredibly important for what's happening at the federal administration and what our state and what local governments need to do to really protect wetlands and our waterways, especially, I know I'm looking outside into a very gloomy flooding season, and wetlands are really important, right, for storage and retention, and especially for communities that consistently flood, which is top of mind to me today. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Molly and Laura. Thanks all.
Okay, so we'll just do some brief introductions. My name is Molly Kordas. I'm a staff attorney at Openlands. I've been there about a year and a half now, full-time, and I got interested in this issue sort of as the most recent Waters of the United States definition was developing, and Laura helped me write a public comment letter on behalf of Openlands in this most recent rulemaking. Outside of Openlands, I'm also on the YP board for IEC. So that's kind of a little bit about me. I don't know if Laura, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Laura Barkusen, and I'm an aquatic ecologist at Openlands. I've been at Openlands since 2004, and before that, I worked for NIPSI, Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, and there I was really focused on wetland mapping and assigning values to wetlands. At Openlands, I've done research on headwater streams, which I'm going to talk about today as well. And I've been really interested in being involved with Molly on the WOTUS issue, because I really feel like if we're going to have clean water and aquatic habitat, it's key to get wetlands and headwaters protected.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. The issue of waters of the United States is infamously complex, as I'm sure most of you know, and the Trump administration's recent redefining of the definition was extremely controversial. So I kind of just want to first go through some of the history and quickly look at kind of the regulatory context and some of the case law in depth, so you can kind of figure out how we got here, and then go through what the new rule actually does. And then I'll let Laura talk about the values and functions of wetlands and headwater streams and some of the other things that would kind of fall in the gaps that the new rulemaking left. So the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 was basically just allowed for, obviously, water pollution control activities. And in 1972, because of all of the water pollution that was occurring and how bad it had gotten, Congress revised and amended that act, which we now call the Clean Water Act. And that was intended to be a complete restructuring and rewriting of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. So the goal of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So what does that mean? What does the nation's waters mean? Originally, it was dependent on literal navigability and use in commerce, and that comes from the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. So that act was really concerned with how with preventing pollution and unregulated blockages and dams of our waters so that they could still be used in interstate commerce. So the term waters of the United States, or WOTUS, has been defined and redefined and revised many, many times over the years. But in that first rewriting of the Clean Water Act in 1972, Representative Kemp said during the House floor debate that they intended to avoid limiting jurisdiction to the old, narrow definitions of navigability. So it was definitely intended to be broader than that, but the question is, million-dollar question is how much broader? And that's sort of what has been, what we've been going back and forth on since about 1972, 1975. So it's a really difficult balance. There is no easy answer. The water pollution in the 70s had risen to a level where it required a national response. But the real question is how much of that is appropriate for the federal government to regulate, and at what point are the states and local officials maybe better equipped to manage their natural resources? So for a while now, there's been a lot of confusion among the circuit courts. And in 2015, the Obama administration attempted to clear a lot of this up and make a hard and fast rule that was a little bit broader than those that had come before it. So that was called the Clean Water Rule, which built upon Justice Kennedy's significant nexus test that he laid out in this case, RAPANOS, which I'll get to a little bit later. The Clean Water Rule was hotly contested and litigated. 31 states filed lawsuits almost immediately, and district courts ended up staying implementation in 13 states. After that, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a nationwide stay and claimed that it had that the circuit courts had exclusive jurisdiction. So in 2017, one of the first things that President Trump did when he came into office was issue this executive order, which required the US EPA and the US Army Corps to review and potentially rescind the Clean Water Rule. And then after that, to revise the rule specifically in accordance with Justice Scalia's opinion in that RAPANOS case. So the agencies did exactly that. They proposed a rule rescinding the Clean Water Rule, recodifying the pre-2015 definition. And then in 2018, the Supreme Court finally ruled on the jurisdictional issue, basically stating that these cases had to go through the federal district courts, and it lifted the nationwide stay. Because it lifted the nationwide stay, the agencies then finalized a rule delaying implementation of the Clean Water Rule for 2 years, basically to give themselves more time to get a new rule out, to figure out some of the litigation that they were involved in. So then that spawned more litigation over the administrative delay, as well as the federal jurisdiction issue. And so what we ended up with was reenactment of the Clean Water Rule, the Obama era rule, in about 26 states, while the rule remained halted in 24 states. So really messy patchwork of federal law, different state to state. And in early 2019, so last February, the agencies finally proposed the new rule redefining waters of the United States. And that was just recently finalized this year on April 21st. So to be clear, there's a lot of case law that I'm not going to get into today from federal and circuit courts, federal district and circuit courts. I'm just going to go through the three major cases that some of the lawyers probably already know, but I really want to focus on sort of what was lost in translation and kind of how we got to the point of this new rule that was just recently finalized. So the first of these cases, US v. Riverside Bayview Homes, came up in 1985, and the basic question was, does Clean Water Act jurisdiction extend to wetlands? So did Congress actually mean to include wetlands when they said our nation's waters? That was the big question. The COOR had in 1975 defined waters of the United States to include tributaries, interstate waters and their tributaries, and non-navigable waters that could affect interstate commerce, including adjacent wetlands. So they specifically included adjacent wetlands, which was contested in court. And the Supreme Court found that the Army Corps' interpretation that adjacent wetlands are inseparably bound up with the waters of the United States was a reasonable ecological judgment and therefore an adequate legal basis. I think an important point in Riverside is that the court only engaged in that analysis because they found that drawing artificial boundaries between land and water is a complex task. It seems like it would be really simple, right? When you look at land and water, it would seem really easy to tell the difference. But what the court found was it was actually a lot more complicated than that. So when you have that kind of difficult line drawing problem where it's not at all clear where the land ends and water begins, the agency's ecological judgments that adjacent wetlands are so intricately interconnected with other waters of the United States. The court found that that was a reasonable conclusion based on the agency's specialized knowledge and expertise, and therefore it was an adequate legal basis to include adjacent wetlands. And they've been included in every definition of waters of the United States since. So the next case that came to the Supreme Court on this issue, which many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with, was solid waste, also known as SWANCC, in 2001. This case dealt with intrastate, basically abandoned gravel pits that had formed permanent and seasonal ponds. So because they were intrastate and technically isolated, they would not normally fall under federal jurisdiction. But because the Army Corps had developed the migratory bird rule, they made the argument that they were waters of the United States. So the migratory bird rule basically said that because these ponds were regularly used as habitat by migratory birds, and migratory birds cross state lines and substantially affect interstate commerce, that those ponds could be considered waters of the United States. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court held that that rule just stretched the Commerce Clause way too far. So it's important to remember a couple of things about waters of the United States. First, the Commerce Clause is always going to act as the absolute maximum of what the federal government can regulate. So the absolute boundaries of what can be regulated federally, it can't go further than what would substantially affect interstate commerce. And part of that is, like I said, because of the origins of the Clean Water Act, but that's in this context without some other justification. If Congress were legislating on it, that is all they would have the power to do. So when they delegate to the federal agencies, that's all the federal agencies can do. So the second thing to remember is that there was a pretty significant shift on the Supreme Court between the time that Riverside was decided and SWANCC. So not only was there a new makeup of justices, but the 90s was a big period of actually limiting federal jurisdiction under the Commerce Clause. So a lot of things had really changed on the court in between these two cases. So the court held that while wetlands can be waters of the United States, in Riverside, the reason they ruled the way they did was because there was this significant nexus between the wetlands and the navigable waters that were involved in that case. So the next case, RAPANOS, came to the Supreme Court in 2006. It was two consolidated cases involving wetlands adjacent to a ditch or a drain that emptied into tributaries to navigable waters. So a little bit further away, but ultimately those adjacent wetlands emptied into navigable waters. The lower courts found that the wetlands were jurisdictional because they were adjacent and physically abutted tributaries to navigable waters. This case was sort of the final wrench that caused all of the confusion in the circuit courts. The main reason for that is that there was no clear majority rule or holding out of this case. It resulted in a plurality judgment, which for the non-lawyers is basically when you have less than 5 justices agreeing on the holding and the rationale. So there is no clear majority. There's no consensus. So in this case, there were 4 justices in the plurality opinion. Justice Kennedy wrote a concurring opinion arriving at the same conclusion, and then there were 3 dissenting justices. So there's a case, Marks v. US, that dictates that in this kind of situation with a plurality, where no single rationale explains the result, the holding can be viewed as that position taken by those members which concurred in the judgment on the narrowest grounds. So you're supposed to kind of look at the plurality opinion and the concurring opinion, and whatever those justices agree on the narrowest grounds, that's the holding out of the case. The problem with that here is that there really is no narrowest ground, no commonality that can be found between the two, because Justice Kennedy completely rejected Justice Scalia's rationale in his concurrence. So they arrived at the same result, but Justice Kennedy got there by using the significant nexus test, which he was sort of building on Riverside and what the court had said about Riverside in SWANCC, and came up with the significant nexus test, where it's about whether there's a significant nexus between the wetland and the navigable water. And that's really done on a case-by-case basis, because given that these are individual ecological judgments that have to be made, it's inherently a case-by-case thing. And so the Marks formula just really doesn't work in this case, unfortunately. So the lower courts were left just kind of trying to figure it out as they went along, and with really no clear precedent to rely on. So getting back to the substance of the case, Justice Scalia relied on the common dictionary definition of water, and from that kind of went through an analysis of some of the geographical terms and inferred a requirement of permanence. So he rejected the use of ecology as an independent basis and came up with the requirement that a water of the United States is one that is continuously present and fixed. And then, like I said, this caused a lot of confusion with the circuit courts. So you can see we had the 7th and 11th circuits using Justice Kennedy's significant nexus test, whereas the 1st, 3rd, and 8th actually followed Justice Stevens' dissent, which said that if you used Scalia's test or Kennedy's test and it was a water of the United States under either, then it was a water of the United States. So 3 circuits were using that approach, and then the rest just never made any formal ruling on which test governs this issue. So that, I think, kind of gets us up to speed on how we got here and why Trump issued that executive order, specifically requiring that the agencies interpret the definition in a manner consistent with Justice Scalia's opinion. Because when the requirement is that it has to be continuously present and fixed, that eliminates a lot of our waters and really narrows the definition in a significant way. So what did the new rule actually do? I'm just going to go through these categories really quickly, just to kind of talk a little bit about what the rule used to be, what the rule is now, how that affects our waters, and then I'll let Laura get into kind of the importance of wetlands and headwater streams and what this rule means. So interstate waters and wetlands, interstate waters have always been the second category of waters of the United States. The first is traditionally navigable waters and territorial seas. So this final rule actually removed interstate waters as an independent category. So the justification for that was that interstate waters is a term that's used within the definition of navigable waters. So the agencies argued that Congress never actually intended to have interstate waters as a separate category independent of commercial navigability. It was intended to be one category, interstate navigable waters. So interstate waters can now still satisfy other categories of waters of the United States, but they just won't become waters of the United States purely through the fact that they cross state lines. So tributaries have also always been a category of waters of the United States. What the real issue is here is that the new rule eliminates the significant nexus test altogether. So the Clean Water Rule had used the significant nexus test as the basis for kind of broadening the reach of the Clean Water Act, and this completely eliminates all of that. So a tributary is now defined as a river, stream, or similar naturally occurring surface water channel that contributes surface water flow, which is important, to a navigable water in a typical year. So because they define the words surface water flow and in a typical year in really narrow ways, this excludes any ephemeral waters. So ephemeral flow is basically when it just is a water that responds only to precipitation. So very little flow otherwise, and can dry up in parts of the year or flood in others. And so this completely eliminates any ephemeral waters, which, as Laura will talk about, is a lot of our headwater streams. And then same thing with lakes and ponds. It excludes lakes and ponds that contribute ephemeral flow or receive ephemeral floodwaters. And for adjacent wetlands, and they've been redefined as those that abut jurisdictional waters or have a direct hydrologic surface connection to another water of the United States. So this excludes any isolated wetlands that lack a direct hydrologic surface connection in a typical year. So like I said, I'll let Laura get into this more and like what that really means. But at the time that the rule was proposed, US EPA estimated that approximately 51% of all wetlands would be excluded from this rule, so left unprotected on the federal level. And then I just wanted to briefly point out that the agencies do have a legal obligation to base these regulations on the best available science. So that comes from a lot of case law that requires a rational connection to the regulations, and then also a couple executive orders from the Clinton and Obama administrations that haven't been rescinded that require the use of best available science in rulemaking. And I also wanted to point out that the US EPA had their own report, the connectivity report, at their disposal during this rulemaking. And that basically outlined a lot of the kinds of things that Laura's going to talk about, how interconnected our waters are, the vital functions that wetlands and smaller streams play in our water system. So they had that information at their disposal and basically justified narrowing the rule, partially, I think, because their hands were tied by the executive order. But they did basically say that just translating that scientific report to legal language, staying within the bounds of what the Constitution allows them to do, just didn't really work, essentially. But ultimately, the agencies do have to regulate in a way that's consistent with the purpose of the Clean Water Act, no matter what. So I think, you know, whether that was done here is certainly debatable at the very least. But I just wanted to point out that they do have an obligation to regulate in a way that's consistent with the Act and uses the best available science. And I will turn it over to Laura.
So Molly's been speaking a lot about wetlands, and I wanted to go over why are wetlands important, what is the function of wetlands to start off here. And wetlands are habitat. They have diverse plants and animals that they support. And over 40% of the threatened and endangered species that are in Illinois are species that are supported by wetlands. So they're really critical habitat for supporting our biodiversity. And wetlands also control flooding. They store runoff and stormwater, and then they hold it and they release it slowly into rivers and streams. And this is really important both for controlling flooding and also for keeping rivers and streams at a more constant flow instead of like getting really low sometimes and being really high at other times, which is something that is also not good for aquatic animals, and that causes erosion. Really high, fast-flowing rivers will remove sediment from banks and from stream beds, and siltation in the rivers will result. So they're really important for storing stormwater and for keeping base flows at a somewhat constant level. And they also are critical for supporting water quality. When nutrients, say, from nearby land, like phosphorus and nitrogen compounds, end up in stormwater when they're stored in wetlands, and that can be transformed by plants in the wetlands before it enters the streams, which helps to protect the streams against things like algal blooms. And lakes against things like algal blooms. So, and they also can remove other types of pollutants and transform other types of pollutants. And they certainly will slow down water and let sediments settle out of it before they enter rivers and streams. So basically, they're really critical for cleaning water, for storing water, and for providing habitat. I'm not sure if I can move my slides. Do you need to move them, Molly, or can I? Let's see. And so the next question is, you heard Molly talk a lot about adjacent wetlands and wetlands with a surface water connection to navigable streams and rivers. So the next question is, so what is an isolated wetland? A wetland that's not adjacent to a navigable stream, river, lake, or that's not connected to them by surface water. And so isolated wetlands are basically wetlands that form in depressions and that are completely surrounded by upland. And they might sometimes have water spill over the surface out in a response to storms, but that's not a constant condition. And these wetlands are basically connected to other waters within a watershed by groundwater. And so sometimes there's a preference to call them geographically isolated wetlands instead of isolated, because they're not hydrologically isolated. They are connected through groundwater to other wetlands. Thank you. And so then the next question is, do isolated wetlands perform different functions from other wetlands, like adjacent wetlands, or wetlands that are connected through the surface, through surface water connections? And basically what has been found through studies is that both isolated and adjacent wetlands are performing the functions of water storage, nutrient and sediment retention, pollutant transformation, and wildlife habitat. That basically they are performing the same functions within the watershed, even if they are geographically isolated. And another thing is that some isolated wetlands are performing functions that adjacent wetlands are not performing, because their isolation, or in some cases their ephemeral condition, causes them to form habitats that lack certain predators who need either a connection to a bigger waterway across the land, or who need permanent water. And a really good example of this is that small isolated temporary wetlands tend to support amphibians, because amphibian larvae can develop within them without being eaten by fish, because they lack predatory fish. So in some cases, so the isolated wetlands are performing the same functions as the adjacent wetlands. And in some cases, they're also performing the additional function of supporting biodiversity in a way that adjacent wetlands do not. So what are some types of geographically isolated wetlands in the United States? I basically listed a number of different types, and in yellow, I highlighted some that we have in our region, including interdunal and intradunal wetlands, kettle hole bogs in regions that were glaciated, and also fens, which is a type of wetland that I mapped when I was doing wetland mapping. And fens are an example of a wetland type that supports biodiversity. They're usually isolated wetlands that are completely saturated with water, and they really support a diverse group of species, some of which are quite rare. They're supporting a lot of endangered species, including dragonflies and butterflies, land snails, And they also help maintain water quality through transformation and retention of nutrients, as we were talking about before. So they are really performing very important ecological and water quality functions. And that's a picture of a fen in northern Cook County that I visited in 2018. And we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. So then another question that occurred to me as I was preparing this slideshow is, how prevalent are isolated wetlands in the United States? If we don't have isolated wetlands, what percentage of wetlands would we lose? And there isn't actually a definitive answer to this question, but looking at a study that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did in the early 2000s, where they had 72 study areas that were across 44 of our states in the U.S. They found that over 50 of those study areas, more than 50% of the wetlands within the study area were what would be considered isolated wetlands. So they appear to be, you know, very prevalent within the U.S. So if these wetlands are not protected, there's really a lot of wetlands that are not protected. And what I'm showing you here, I'm not sure how well you can see this. This is a map of Elgin Township from the Kane County ADID, which was the wetland inventory that I did, worked on and did mapping for. And so if you look at this, so this is Elgin, and the Fox River is that ribbon of blue that's going across the right side of the township. And then all the orange wetlands that you see on the map are ones that we determined were performing significant stormwater storage functions and nutrient retention functions. And you can see some of them are adjacent and are right next to the Fox River, and a lot of them are not adjacent to the river. And then if you look carefully, you could also see some green colored wetlands, and those are the ones that we determined to be high habitat quality. And then the tiny little red spots that are throughout that map show the fens that we mapped. So you can see, you know, what these wetlands look like on the landscape in at least this part of our region, and the different functions that they're performing, and that a lot of them are not adjacent to navigable water. All right, next. And now I'm gonna sort of transition to talking about headwater streams. And the fen that I showed you a picture of before, in northern Cook County, there's another picture of it in the bottom picture in this slide. And then above is actually the headwater stream that is associated with that fen. So it seemed like a good transition slide. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the next question is, what are headwater streams? And headwater streams have several different definitions, but what they basically are is the very small streams that are the very beginning of streams and that are the very beginning of our river systems. And I drew a picture here to show you. Let's first look at the thing that looks like a little blue tire. And that is supposed to represent a spring where groundwater is coming out and is forming a channel. And so that forms a headwater stream. So these are areas where streams begin. And then above that, I've taken a graphic of a wetland to show, you know, that sometimes these headwater streams are associated with wetlands and receiving water from wetlands. So they're tiny, They're all over the landscape. And the ones that I drew as red are what we call first order streams, because there is no other stream that confluences with them. They are the very beginning. And then as they flow together, I change the color to orange, and that would show a second order stream. And then as you go downward in the watershed, you get bigger and bigger streams as more and more little ones come together, until finally you get like your fifth order rivers or higher, which are your kind of becoming your big navigable rivers. So anyway, that is the main way that we at Openlands define them. And there are some other definitions of them that I put up on this slide too, but basically they're where the streams are beginning. All right, and next slide. So what are the functions of headwater streams? They are the tiny streams, and this is a picture of one in McHenry County, actually, where we were doing some aquatic sampling a couple of years ago. Anyway, the functions that headwater streams perform turn out to be really similar to the functions that wetlands perform. They remediate pollutants, they retain sediments, and this is especially true, or appears to be especially true, of the ones that are ephemeral and that dry up sometimes. Some of these headwaters are permanent and some are ephemeral. And the ephemeral ones tend to be really good at removing sediments from waterways. And they also help control flow in the downstream waterways. They supply organic material. Since they are small, shallow streams, they kind of represent an interaction with land that is more, I don't know what to say, like intense than the bigger rivers. They're kind of like fingers reaching shallowly across the landscape. And when leaves, for example, or vegetation fall into them and decay, you get this sort of energy and organic matter that enters your stream system, and that then actually sustains aquatic life throughout stream systems. And they, like wetlands, also provide habitat for breeding, for sheltering of aquatic species. And some of the smaller ephemeral ones also act to support creatures that from predators who then can't live in them because they're ephemeral. And they play also a really critical role in water chemistry and transforming nutrients within stream and river systems, which we also talked about with wetlands. So super important to water quality and habitat. And next slide. And the question of how prevalent they are is like wetlands, or like isolated wetlands. They are very prevalent on the landscape. Throughout the whole United States, probably about 50% of our stream and river miles are headwater streams. And in the Midwest, it is even a higher percent, with some research in Ohio showing that maybe like 80% of our stream miles are in headwaters. So to sum up, the protection of wetlands, including isolated wetlands and headwaters, is just critical to clean water and aquatic habitat. And then I will send it back to Molly.
So I just wanted to give a couple quick updates on where we are now, and then hopefully we can answer some questions. So back in February, there were a couple of groups that filed notices of intent to sue over the rulemaking, actually, interestingly, under the Endangered Species Act, because the agencies were supposed to consult under a provision of the Endangered Species Act, because this affects so much habitat. So those were both led by the Center for Biological Diversity and the NRDC. And then, my slide won't turn. There we go. Just some quick legislation updates. So during the proposed rulemaking, there was the Define WOTUS Act, which was introduced in Congress. I really think this was more of a symbolic show of support for the administration. It basically just parroted everything that's in the rulemaking with some other changes, and it really hasn't gone anywhere since then. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are several states, including Illinois, that are currently exploring ways to protect wetlands on the state and local level until the definition of WOTUS can be addressed again. So California actually defined waters of the state to kind of mirror the federal definition, but in a much more protective way. I believe they even protect groundwater. And then California, Michigan, and Wisconsin all, and I'm sure there are other states too, but these three states all started fee and lieu programs to protect wetlands. So basically trying to deter the destruction of wetlands. So if, for example, you're constructing something and you have to fill a wetland, you would still be able to do it, but you're gonna have to pay a pretty decent chunk of change to do it. And then lastly, I just wanted to give my 2 cents. My personal opinion is that we may just need a federal legislative fix for this. You know, I think part of the problem is that every 4 to 8 years, we're just kind of going back and forth. And, you know, like I said, every 4 to 8 years, it's like we swing wildly to the left or wildly to the right. And I just think with all of the confusion it's already created in the court system, that isn't really working. It's just producing more and more litigation and muddying the issue even more. So ultimately, I think it just needs to be kind of a policy issue with one single confident voice coming out of Congress, you know, deciding how we're going to address water quality going forward. And I think if the goal really is to restore and maintain the integrity of our nation's waters, that's the way we have to go, and we have to be serious about it. And I know I think we have some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Molly and Laura. I know there were others in the chat who expressed similarly how informative this was. And I think, as I was saying to you both before we started, this is an issue, you know, certainly near my heart, near my interest. We agree that we need some kind of permanence here. So definitely echoing that. And, you know, IEC has been happy to partner with Openlands and other of our members to work on that Illinois legislation to at least protect these streams and wetlands here in our state. You know, as Laura mentioned, the Midwest having such a high percentage of things like headwater streams, it's really critical to at least have states lead where we may not be able to depend on the federal administration or Congress. So, you know, that really highlighted and stuck to me. Our executive director, who I think is on now, was just on a webinar talking about how states need to lead. So excited that Openlands is continuing to do that in our community here. It also really drove home to me the importance of science, right? You know, you from your presentation, there was so much about, you know, whether or not things are scientific based, or if isolated versus non-isolated are providing similar functions. So again, just consistency and really needing that. We did have some questions in the chat. I think one that wasn't necessarily addressed that could be helpful is maybe to frame, like, where are wetlands? I think it's easy to think that they're, you know, large wetlands, things like Emaquan, of course, being maybe a gold standard, and places in rural and suburban. But, you know, Laura, I think, mentioned Elgin. And so, you know, the question was, if wetlands are only in suburban and rural areas, how does this impact cities? And maybe you could even express how there are wetlands in cities as well.
Yeah, there are wetlands in cities. In fact, Openlands was recently looking at some land within the city in the Calumet area, and finding even a large high quality wetland in the Calumet area. So, I mean, many times wetlands have been drained, you know, for some reason. So they used to exist, and then somebody, for reasons of development or farming, has drained them. And so they're former wetlands, and we have a lot of those. But we also have wetlands, certainly within the city limits, as well as, you know, out in less developed areas like rural and suburban areas, although rural areas have certainly had their share of draining wetlands for farming.
Thanks, Laura. I don't know, Molly, feel free to jump in too. Another question was about wetland delineation and how often these determinations were updated. And I saw Sharon provided some context there, but maybe Molly or Laura, if one of you could answer that process.
Answer the process of how often wetlands are delineated?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I really know how to answer that, because I would think that wetlands would be delineated in response to, so for example, if, you know, if a developer was planning to do some kind of transformation of the landscape, that there would be a requirement to, you know, regulatorily speaking, to show where wetlands were or were not. And when we did the wetland mapping that I was showing you for Kane County, that was basically to be able to determine in advance, you know, what could be done on what part of the landscape. And when we finished that, we actually did a presentation, you know, that included developers in the audience so that they could understand, you know, what that landscape looked like. And as far as I know, you know, there's no sort of regular cycle on which wetlands are delineated. I don't know if you know anything more about that, Molly.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what you said. But I would just add, so there's a couple of processes. One is wetland delineation, another is wetland determinations. And so, like, often if you have a project and you have a wetland on your property and you think you might be doing an activity that's going to affect that wetland, you would need to get sort of that jurisdictional determination from the Army Corps of Engineers to determine, like, yes, this is a wetland, and yes or no, it's a water of the United States. And then there's also wetland delineations that are done pretty much anytime you have a project that could affect one. So like Laura said, that can be construction projects, but that can also include like wetland or other habitat restoration projects. So Openlands has worked on things where we've had to get wetland delineations for some of the restoration work.
Great, thanks. Something else I thought maybe you could answer, and of course, if there are questions you have that weren't addressed, Laura and Molly's contact information is here, and yes, these slides and this entire recording are available after the fact too. But, you know, we left with the new Trump administration rulemaking was approved, I think you said April 21st. So feels like a long time ago, not that long ago, last week. And so since then, there have been environmental organizations and partners that have filed suit. Where do you see that case going, and what are the powers of it to maybe get a stay on the Trump administration's order? You know, are we going to continue to play some legal ping pong at the federal level with that case that was just put forward by the environmental groups?
Yeah, you know, I definitely don't think that we've seen the end of this in the court system. I think I think we're just going to have to wait and see how that goes. I think eventually this could end up at the Supreme Court, but debatable whether we would want that to happen as an environmental community, which, you know, 2 weeks ago would have been the way I answered it. And then we had sort of a recent decision on the Maui County case in Hawaii from the Supreme Court that actually protected groundwater, although in a different way. Definitely was not on this particular issue. It just involves some of the same arguments. But yeah, so I think it's debatable how the Supreme Court would actually handle something like this right now. So, I mean, that's partially too why I say I think a legislative fix long-term is the answer, though maybe not with this particular Congress. You know, I don't know the reality of making that work anytime soon, but I think that really has to be the long-term answer. Just kind of given, you know, like I talked about in the presentation, how much was lost in translation between these cases, because you've got cases more than 10 years apart where the court is changing dramatically in that time. So I think this is definitely not over. I think it's going to keep being litigated, but I do think the ultimate solution has to be legislative.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate that. And I saw someone mentioned Michigan, I think, having a Wetland Protection Act, and Illinois, as Molly knows, and Stacy and others, has one sort of on the books, but we are, you know, continuing to work on state legislation here. We're lucky, you know, to have a governor who cares about protecting our environment, and so hopefully that is something that we can continue to work on. There was a final question that I think we can kind of get to in maybe a brief answer, but could you elaborate, Molly, on the Maui County Clean Water Act case before the court?
Sure. So that basically dealt with it's a different area of Clean Water Act law, but it dealt with like a point source discharge, I believe from a wastewater treatment plant. And so what they were doing was essentially putting the pipe straight down into the ground to discharge the some of the pollutants. And what was happening was it was contaminating the groundwater, and then that groundwater was over time emptying into the ocean, and so it was getting into a navigable water. And point source discharges are regulated under the Clean Water Act, but basically it was this question of, typically we don't regulate groundwater that way, but on the other side of the coin, allowing companies and wastewater treatment plants to do things like this, it basically just creates a really easy workaround. If you can just stick the pipe straight down into the ground, into the groundwater, and you don't have to worry about whether you're polluting the water eventually or at all, that would be a really terrible loophole. And that's basically what the court ended up deciding. So it was a huge relief, I think, to the environmental community that they came out that way. But the court basically said, like, we cannot justify this kind of loophole.
Thank you for that clarification, Molly, and thank you to Openlands, to Molly, Laura, for giving this incredibly informative Lunch and Learn today. We had almost 60 people on, which is wonderful. If you did not get the link for CLE or it wasn't working somehow, again, just reach out to IEC and we'll get that settled for you. This will be recorded, and if you're able to continue to contribute to IEC and the work that we're doing to protect wetlands and our waterways here in Illinois, you can do so through our website, and I dropped a link into the chat as well. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Openlands, and enjoy the rest of your day. Be healthy, be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.